Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks. We're moving right along with our Theros Beyond Death archetype breakdown, where we are going video by video, taking two of the individual color pairs or color archetypes within Theros Beyond Death Limited and kind of breaking them down. Again, we're not doing a full card by card set review because it's frankly just not worth the squeeze. It takes a lot of time to put those together, and it usually doesn't get a bunch of views. And for myself, it's useful, but I haven't had a lot of feedback saying that it's been useful for other people. So I thought I'd take a different approach to help myself and help other people get ready for pre-release. And we're doing that in individual color pairs here. So we've gone through a lot of the color pairs already. This is part 4, so this will be the 8th and 9th one, and then the next video will have the last 2 color pairs, followed by a separate video that will talk about devotion decks and monocolored decks. This time we're going to be looking at green-white and blue-white. Green-white is a little bit more straightforward than blue-white, and we'll talk about blue-white when we get to it, but it's pretty loose here. So far we've talked about some pretty linear strategies, things like the 4 power matters in Gruul or the flash archetype for blue-red, so on and so forth. This time it's going to be a little bit more freeform because the archetypes aren't as well defined as far as a linear strategy goes. So that's the game plan here. Before we get into the first color pair for this video, make sure you subscribe below. If this has been in any way, shape, or form useful for you, feel free to leave a comment giving me any sort of feedback, whether the video isn't quite up to snuff, given that it's made in like 1997 Microsoft PowerPoint or something like that. But, feel free to give any sort of constructive feedback in the comments below. You can also find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks, which admittedly I don't use that very often, but that's because there really aren't followers on Twitter. So if we get followers on Twitter, I will be a little bit more active on there. So anyway, that's our game plan for today. Let's go ahead and jump right on into the first of these 2 archetypes, which is green-white. This one's a little bit strange. So it is enchantment based. It is kind of a constellation deck, but it's a little bit more specific in its desired archetype. In particular, green-white cares about having enchantment creatures or creatures that are enchanted on the board. So it's a little bit more specific than just a straight up constellation deck. It wants you to have a specific type of board presence, either in the form of enchantment creatures or enchanted creatures. And again, this is a little loose, right? If you just play green cards and you play white cards together and you don't really have a bunch of synergy, that's fine. You'll probably still have a functional deck, but there are some synergy cards that kind of come together and make the strategy work. So if you're not drafting a bunch of actual enchantment creatures, you're going to have to be looking for auras to put on your creatures to maximize on some of these effects. So again, a little bit loose, but that is kind of the game plan. A constellation or enchantment deck, if you will, that specifically cares about having enchanted or enchantment creatures on the board. So, as always, we're going to start off with the payoff cards, and we are going to start that with the gold uncommon for the set. That is Siona, Captain of the Pyleus. This is like, Jonas, I assume? It's 1 green, white for a 2/2 uncommon legendary human soldier. So 3 mana 2/2. Okay, not great. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may reveal an aura from among them and put it in your hand. The rest go to the bottom randomly. So if you have a bunch of auras, and I think most decks will have a decent number of auras in them, then Pyleus, or rather Siona, is going to give you a pretty significant delve into your library to find one of those auras. 7 cards is a lot, and it means that if you've got, 3-4 auras in your deck, Siona is going to give you a good shot at picking one of those up. She does a little bit more, right? Obviously, if this is a 3 mana 2/2 that draws you into a relevant aura, that's already a pretty decent card. We talked about Heliod's Pilgrim and how Heliod's Pilgrim is going to be relevant in this format a lot more so than it already was in M15, or even the Master set it was in, whatever set that was. Maybe it was Battle Bond, I don't know. But it's always been relevant. In this set, it's going to be very good. Captain of the Pyleus is a little bit worse than Heliod's Pilgrim in that you don't get the full selection and don't guarantee a card, but Siona does give you a little bit of card selection and has an additional effect tacked onto it. She says, Whenever an aura you control becomes attached to a creature you control, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. So she pays you off for putting auras on your own creatures. Now, it only works if the auras are under your control, so you won't get 1/1s if your opponent sticks an aura on your creature. And it only works if you are putting them on your own creature, so you don't get paid off for putting a pacifism type effect on an opponent's creature. It has to be one of your auras, and it has to attach to one of your creatures. Note that you don't actually have to cast the aura, you just simply have to put the aura on something. So if, say, an aura comes back from the graveyard and it automatically attaches to a creature, that will trigger Siona. Now, this is a pretty sweet payoff. Green-white is not necessarily the go-wide strategy, right? But if you can somehow combine this with the Boros deck, or if you pick up some of those white heroes we talked about when we were talking about the Boros strategy, then Siona gives you a pretty good incentive to draft auras and make sure you can turn those auras into additional 1/1 creatures. Destiny Spinner is a card we will talk about in a couple of the other archetypes as well, the enchantment-based archetypes. She is 1 in a green for a 2/3 uncommon human creature, an enchantment creature, that matters, and it says creatures and enchantment spells you control can't be countered. So that's relevant text. It won't come up too often, but it is relevant text, right? There are a decent number of counter spells, I believe, across uncommon and common. There are at least 3 that I can think of off the top of my head. The rare ones, there's Thassa's Intervention, and there's also Ashiok's Erasure, although that does get around this ability. But basically, it's trinket text on an already decent body, right? A 2-mana 2/3 is a solid card, and this is actually an enchantment creature itself, which is going to matter a lot for this archetype, because the archetype cares about having enchantments on board. She also has an activated ability, 3 in a green, target land you control becomes an XX elemental with trample and haste until end of turn, where X is the number of enchantments you control. It's still a land, so it can still tap for mana. That's a pretty decent mana sink, and it does want you to have a bunch of enchantments on board for you to be able to turn lands into giant creatures. Now, let's say Destiny Spinner is the only enchantment on board. That can still turn a land into a 1/1 with haste, which isn't a super good card, but it's something, right? Especially if you're flooding out, you might be able to make chump blockers out of extra lands, so on and so forth, things of that nature. So not exactly a busted effect if you're just turning lands into 1/1s, and it also costs 4 mana to activate this ability, so even if you have a ton of lands, it's not likely that you're making like a 7/7 or 8/8. I can see in the late game maybe being able to make 3/3s or 4/4s with this ability and turning those sideways at the opponent, right? 4 mana is a lot to activate this ability, but it is upside on, again, a creature that you're already willing to play as a 2-mana 2/3 that provides you an enchantment on board. So it's pretty sweet. Note that if you activate this ability and this is the only enchantment on board, and then they kill Destiny Spinner in response, you will create a 0/0, and you will basically just kill one of your own lands. So watch out for that, but solid card for any enchantment-based deck that cares about green cards. Nyx Herald is up next. It's 2 in a green for a 2/3 uncommon enchantment creature. It is a Centaur Shaman. And it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, target enchanted creature or enchantment creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. So this is a pretty solid card. On its own, it can target itself since it is an enchantment creature, which means this can reliably attack as a 3-mana 3/4 trampler, which is just going to be a really good card on curve. Imagine going Destiny Spinner into Nyx Herald. That's just a really good curve of well-statted aggressive creatures with relevant abilities. This can also throw its ability around on other creatures. So, for example, there is a cycle of vanilla commons in this set, the Nyxborn cycle, that all happen to be enchantment creatures. And the green one is a 6-mana 7/6 with no abilities. Being able to just target that with Nyx Herald and turn it into an 8-power trampler is very relevant, and you do not have to pay mana to trigger this ability or use it. So as long as you just have what green-white wants to be doing on board, this thing's ability is going to be very relevant during combat. So that moves us into our enablers. Our synergy cards, again, not exactly the cards that pay you off for being in the strategy, but cards that make the strategy work a little bit better, or otherwise work in this deck that would not work in other decks. First one I want to talk about, and we won't talk long about it because I don't think it's actually a great card, is Inspire Awe. It's 3 in a green, 4 mana for a common instant that says prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn, except combat damage, that would be dealt by enchanted creatures and enchantment creatures. Scry 2 for some reason. You can tell when they think a card is bad because they just tack Scry onto it. But the reason I mention this here is because this card, even though it's basically wildly unplayable, is going to be at its best, if it's playable at all, in this archetype in green-white, because you are already incentivized to draft enchantment creatures or find ways to put enchantments on your creatures, and that can theoretically turn this into a one-sided fog, and one-sided fogs tend to be playable, whereas regular fogs don't. The problem with this card is that there are just so many enchantment creatures and enchantments floating around this set that I think it's never actually going to be one-sided. You can go all in on this card and draft nothing but enchantment creatures, and it still might not be a one-sided fog because your opponent might just randomly have enchantment creatures on board, and you can't really control that. So I'm saying stay away from this card, but I did want to mention it here because it was built specifically for this archetype. I just think it's not the payoff you're looking for. Heliod's Pilgrim, can't talk about it too much more because we've already said all we can say about it, but if you're looking to put auras in your deck, if you're looking to get your creatures enchanted, or if you just happen to have auras that are worth slapping on an opponent's creature and removing them from the equation, Heliod's Pilgrim does a good job of fetching those auras up. Karametra's Blessing is a combat trick. It's a single white mana for a common instant, and it gives target creature +2/+2 until end of turn. So that's the base ability. No matter what deck you're playing, no matter what you target, it's a 1 mana +2/+2, and those have traditionally been playable, if not amazing, right? It's also a targeted ability, which might matter for some of those hero cards like the 2/2 or the 1/4 flyer. On top of that, it says if the target is an enchanted creature or an enchantment creature, it gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. I actually love effects like this. 1 mana instance that can just save a creature from a removal spell. I'm thinking something like God's Willing. It's just usually very efficient and possible and very likely that you can find a single white mana to hold up to save a relevant creature. Now, it's worth mentioning that Hexproof and Indestructible is not the baseline for this combat trick. You have to actually target an enchantment creature or enchanted creature in order to get that extra little bonus, but it's not too hard to do that, especially if you're actively trying to draft that deck. So this will give anything +2/+2, which is relevant, but if you happen to be playing this in the archetype that cares most about enchantment and enchanted creatures, this is going to get an extra little bonus of being a protection spell against some of your opponent's relevant removal. Transcendent Envoy we talked about in the previous video, I believe, when we talked about black-white auras, but it's kind of similar here, right? You want to be enchanting your own creatures. You want enchanted creatures, which means you're going to want anything that says the word enchantment in the type line, as well as auras to turn creatures that aren't enchantments into enchanted creatures. And Transcendent Envoy kind of fits both realms, right? Again, I wanted to mention the body on this card's not great. You shouldn't be taking 4 or 5 Transcendent Envoys and jamming them into a limited deck, but if you end up in one of these Enchantment Matters sub-themes, especially the ones where auras end up being very important, then I think Transcendent Envoy is a card that you would love to have as a one-of to potentially curve into some expensive enchantments. And that moves us into the rares for the archetype, the cards that are going to be at their best in green-white, even though some of them will be playable outside of green-white. The first one is our homeboy Planeswalker Calyx Destiny's Hand. Basically an Enchantment Matters Planeswalker. It's 2 green-white. It is a 4 loyalty Mythic Walker. It says +1, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an enchantment card or from among them. Put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom randomly. So +1 should net you card advantage. Again, you will just naturally have a bunch of enchantments in your deck without trying very hard because half of the creatures in this set just so happen to be enchantments on top of just being regular creatures, right? So it shouldn't be too hard for you to +1 basically draw a relevant card. And it's going to be an enchantment, so that means you're never drawing a land off of this ability. Sure, it can whiff, right? Sometimes you won't have more than like 12, 13 enchantments in your deck, and that is a possibility to whiff, but this is ticking up while doing it, and it is potential card advantage over the course of a game, which makes, I think, the +1 already relevant in a deck that cares about having a mass of enchantments. The -3 ability says, exile target creature or enchantment you don't control until target enchantment you control leaves the battlefield. So it's a unique way of turning one of your enchantments into an Oblivion Ring or a Prison Realm or whatever you want to call it, right? basically you can take, as long as you have an enchantment on board and you're fairly sure that enchantment's not going anywhere for a while, then you can turn that enchantment into a prison, if you will, into a removal spell for one of your opponent's creatures or enchantments. The problem, of course, and I mentioned this in the black-white video, is that this is an enchantment-themed set, so by the time we get into the kind of routine of drafting Theros, people will catch on to the fact that they should be main decking enchantment removal, and that makes an effect like the -3 here a lot worse, because your opponent will just have natural answers to what you're trying to do here. I think the trick here, if you're using Calyx and you're relying on the -3 to be reliable removal, is choose your worst enchantment, your least necessary enchantment to be the target of this. That way your opponent has to blow removal spells on a really crappy card. Don't choose your best enchantment on board to be the prison, to be the O-ring. Otherwise your opponent is already incentivized to kill that card and they get their card back too. Make them use their removal on a bad enchantment. Don't target one of your good enchantments. The -7, and honestly, -7 is feasible with a Planeswalker that just ticks up to draw cards, essentially. The -7 says return all enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So in a normal set, that would be kind of something to scoff at, but in an enchantment-based set where a lot of the enchantments happen to be creatures, yeah, that's relevant. You can bring a bunch of creatures back. Couple notes about that, though, is you do need to be very heavy on enchantments for that to matter, and I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse at this point, but you need to make sure if you have a Calyx and you intend to play it, that you are prioritizing enchantment creatures over just regular creatures. And on top of that, keep in mind that there's a lot of graveyard hate in this set. There's just tons and tons of graveyard hate, including cards that can exile all the creatures from your graveyard. So that -7 may not be all it's chalked up to be. You're basically getting the +1 and the -3 here, which I think together makes a nice little package for an enchantment deck. Not a bomb Planeswalker in the same degree as Elspeth and Ashiok, but still a very relevant one for a niche strategy. Bronze-Hide Lion, this seems like it's going to be one of the best rares you can open in the set. It's just kind of busted. Green-white for a 3/3. It's a rare cat. So green-white 3/3, no downside, double upside. For green-white, you can also activate its ability to gain indestructible until end of turn. Like, okay, 2 mana 3/3, not super hard to cast. You might not be able to cast it on curve in a green-white deck, but for just 2 mana, you get a 3/3, so that's a Watch Wolf, if you will. And then for 2 more mana, you can just protect it, right? Give it indestructible. Now, it doesn't gain hexproof. Obviously, this card is a little bit of a callback to Fleecemane Lion, but Fleecemane Lion could gain hexproof. So don't make that mistake thinking that this is protected from everything. There are common removal spells that can give this -3/-3 and kill it off. But it's fine because it says, when Bronze-Hide Lion dies, return it to the battlefield. It's an aura enchantment with enchant creature you control, and it gives the enchanted creature green-white. That creature gains indestructible until end of turn. The aura will lose all of its other abilities, though. So Bronze-Hide Lion will no longer have the ability to come back. It's not like it comes back over and over and over again because it loses that ability. So just to break it down, you've got a 2 mana 3/3. You can pay 2 mana to give it indestructible, and when it dies, it comes back as an aura attached to one of your creatures, and it gives its protection ability to that creature. This is just kind of an insano card when you think about it, given that it's already a 2 mana 3/3 and it has no downside. If you cast this thing on curve, it's probably getting a couple hits in there or trading with something. Even if your opponent kills it right away, there's potential to get value out of it. Now, I would warn people, if you have this card, to make sure you have other creatures on board before you really put it in harm's way. So if you have a 3-drop in your hand and you have a Bronze-Hide Lion on turn 2, it might be correct in some situations to wait until after turn 3 to play your Bronze-Hide Lion. That way when it comes back, it has something to attach to it. Missing out on that value turns this into a pretty average, still a below or an above rate creature, but a pretty average corner case, right? You want to make sure this is dying and turning into an enchantment, and that could matter. It turns something into an enchanted creature, which for green-white is relevant, but it's worth noting that the Bronze-Hide Lion itself is not an enchantment. So altogether, an awesome little package that has a little bit of a strategic play to it and is going to be very threatening for the opponent. Mantle of the Wolf. This is a generically good green card, I believe. If you are playing green and you have this card in your pool, I find it hard to believe that you shouldn't be playing it. It's 3 and a green for a rare aura. It gives the enchanted creature +4/+4, and when the Mantle of the Wolf is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, create 2/2/2 green wolf creature tokens. So this makes anything on board an absolute monster if you can land it onto that creature, right? If this fizzles in response, like if you cast it, target one of your creatures, and the target goes away, and this just goes to the graveyard, it's countered. It never hit the battlefield, so it doesn't go from the battlefield to the graveyard. You won't get those wolves. But as long as this sticks to a creature at some point or another, no matter what happens to that creature, you're going to get the wolves out of it. And the important part here is that it triggers when the enchantment goes to the graveyard, not when the creature goes to the graveyard. So your opponent, normally with a card like this, would just use a bounce spell to send your creature back to your hand, and then the mantle would go away and you would get nothing. But if your opponent does that with this card, the mantle will go to the graveyard and trigger, and you'll get the wolves out of the deal. So basically, this makes a must-answer threat, and when they do answer it, you get a couple little threats out of the deal, which altogether is a nice package. You know, pick your poison. Make sure that you know when you're casting this card it's going to land. It's very splashable as well, but once it does land, you should be looking pretty good that game. It does play pretty poorly against pacifism type effects, so watch out for that. But if you can find a way, even if they pacify your creature, to maybe sacrifice it or kill it, then you still get value out of the mantle. Cetacean Champion is up next, and this is a card we'll mention again for blue-green. It is 2 and a green for a 1/3 human warrior. It's a rare, and it has Constellation. It says whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Cetacean Champion and draw a card. So just a generic good green Constellation card. If you're playing a green deck and you happen to have a bunch of enchantments, or if you are incentivized to be drafting enchantments, then Cetacean Champion is going to be one of your go-to cards. Very easily first pickable because it's so good in basically any green deck, even though I think green-white is the natural home for this card. Archon of Sun's Grace we've already talked about in a previous video, but as I mentioned before, this card is an absolute bomb if you have no other enchantments in your deck, and if you even get 1 or 2 enchantments on the battlefield, this is a game-winning card on its own, so I wanted to mention it again here. These Constellation rares are very good. Doesn't really matter what color combination you're in. It's not dependent on those colors, but Archon of Sun's Grace, Cetacean Champion, so on and so forth. These are just going to be awesome cards in any deck that's really going out of its way to draft enchantments. Idyllic Tutor, also we mentioned this before, this is the 3-mana sorcery that tutors up an enchantment and puts it in your hand. Should be pretty straightforward while we're mentioning this card again. You care about enchantments, you're putting a bunch of enchantments in your deck. In a lot of ways, Idyllic Tutor, even though expensive for this sort of effect, is a toolbox type card in a set like this. It can fetch up a removal spell, or it can fetch up a creature 9 times out of 10. So you get to kind of pick and choose what you need for a situation and use the tutor to help you find those answers. And that moves us into blue-white. Okay, look, blue-white, in my opinion, and blue-green, as we'll mention in the next video, are the loosest of the archetypes. The gold cards don't exactly tell a good story of what that archetype's trying to do, and these are the least linear strategies in the format. What I want to say to kind of preface that, though, is that that doesn't necessarily mean that blue-white is bad, right? It might just be that putting a bunch of blue-white cards together that care about enchantments and have a bunch of enchantments leads into just a good deck. It just means that you're not pushed in any way, shape, or form to draft certain cards necessarily. So your kind of theme here for blue-white is just basically Constellation. You want to look for cards that trigger when enchantments come into the battlefield, and you want to look for enchantments to do that triggering, right? So blue-white, you kind of have a little bit of flexibility. It's not as straightforward and linear as something like Gruul that says, oh, look, draft 4 power creatures, and that's your deck. Or red-white, which says, draft heroic creatures and targeted spells, that's your deck, right? Blue-white is more like, hey, we've got an enchantment block, blue and white care about enchantments, find a way to win with those cards. So we should be able to go 3, 2, 1. So with that being said, we should be able to go through this one pretty quickly. Starting with the payoff cards, we do want to talk about the gold uncommon here. And look, it's really only here because it happens to be an enchantment, and it can be a pretty decent one. Staggering Insight is white-blue for an uncommon aura. It enchants a creature, and that enchanted creature gets +1/+1 in lifelink and the Curiosity ability. When it deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Now, this is very similar to something like Curious Obsession, which we saw back in Ixalan or Rivals, I don't know. And that was a decent card if you could stick it on an evasive creature that was going to be able to get in turn after turn after turn. Stagger and Insight gives you lifelink on top of that. So yeah, this is the type of card that if you stick it on a creature, maybe even a creature that cares about having an aura on it or something like that, and you get to attack turn after turn, you should be a favorite to win that game just because you're going to be drawing cards, you're lifelinking, so you're winning a race, and you're just going to get very far ahead of your opponent. I think Stagger and Insight is a fantastic card, and if you are in blue-white, it should be a card that you get paid off for playing in your deck, but you do need to make sure you're putting some evasive creatures, whether unblockable creatures or flyers in your deck, to really take advantage of it. The other card I wanted to mention here, and again, this isn't like a huge payoff. It's not really a card that you're like, yes, we got a Brine Giant, let's go. But it is something that's going to work at its best in blue-white or perhaps blue-green. Brine Giant is 6 and a blue, 7 mana for a 5/6 vanilla creature, and it costs 1 less to cast for each enchantment you control. In a normal set, this would just be a horrendous failure of a card, but there are times you're going to be casting this for 3 or 4 mana. You might not cast it on turn 3 or turn 4, but a lot of times you can cast this kind of card for a lot less than what you would normally pay for a 5/6, just because blue-white is going to have a bunch of enchantments that kind of stay on the board, whether it's your creatures or your Banish and Light type effect, or your auras like Stagger and Insight. So again, Brine Giant, you don't want to draft every single Brine Giant and be the guy who's playing the quote-unquote Brine Giant deck, but it is a common that's here for these enchantment-based strategies to kind of just put a bunch of beef on board. And that moves us into our enablers, our synergy cards. We're going to see a lot of enchantments and things that care about enchantments in this category, starting with Banish and Light. This is a reprint from original Theros. Might have been Born of the Gods, I'm not sure, but whatever, Theros block. It's 2 and a white, and it's your pretty standard O-ring type effect. When it enters the battlefield, you get to exile a non-land permanent your opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. Cards like this matter a lot. Having your removal in the form of enchantments is very relevant for this set because it lets you set up your constellation creatures and turn your removal spells into value spells, right? To trigger constellation on top of getting rid of your opponent's threats. All of the dangers I've already mentioned about enchantments apply to Banish and Light and cards like this. Since your opponent is going to be running a lot more enchantment removal, these cards lose a little bit of their luster, whereas in a normal set they usually go unchecked. Similar, we have, let me try this out, yeah, we have this card. It's 2 and a white to turn an enchanted creature into, it's 2 and a blue, and it turns an enchanted creature into a 0/1 blue fish with base power and toughness 0/1. That creature does lose all abilities, so think Frogify from Throne of Eldraine for an additional mana, but it's a 0/1 instead of a 1/1, which basically takes it out of the equation completely, and it loses all of its abilities. So this is just a good on-board way of dealing with a creature. I normally like effects like this a lot more than other people. People tend to say when they're reviewing cards like this that it loses a lot of its value because that creature can just chump block, and it's almost like you gave your opponent a free chump blocker, but you also need to take care of creatures sometimes. You just have to get a creature out of the way, and Ichthyomorphosis is going to be a good way of dealing with that. Maybe not the best way, but a good way to do it. Worth noting, again, this is just a way to kill an opponent's creature while also triggering Constellation and getting enchantments on board. This is what I'm talking about when I say something like Brine Giant is a payoff, because you're going to be playing enchantments that just kind of stick around for a little while, and that can make your Brine Giants a lot cheaper. Shoal Kraken, I believe we mentioned this in the blue-black video to start off the series, but it's 4 and a blue for a 3/5 uncommon Kraken, and the Constellation trigger says whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card, and if you do, discard a card. So you get to loot on Constellation with a body that matters. A 3/5 is a pretty relevant body that does a lot of blocking, and in the late game can actually start attacking too. Again, not a busted card, right? You're not picking up a Shoalcracker and saying, all right, boys, we're going blue-white. But if you happen to be drafting blue cards and drafting white cards, then Shoalcracker should do a pretty good job. Shimmer Wing Chimera is 3 and a blue for a 3/2 uncommon enchantment creature. It's a Chimera with flying, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, return up to 1 target enchantment you control to its owner's hand. So there was a card back in one of the Theros sets, maybe Journey into Nyx, called Riptide Chimera, I believe, and it had a mandatory clause to bounce an enchantment back from your battlefield to the hand, and you could replay those enchantments during your turn. Worst case scenario, you had to bounce itself back because it was in fact an enchantment if you didn't control any others, and I absolutely love that card. Now, it's worth noting in that set, there were tons and tons of auras that cantripped when it came into play, and I do believe this set has a cycle of enchantments that give you some sort of enter the battlefield effect, but I don't believe they cantrip. So it's a lot harder to combo this card with auras, but it does make it a lot easier to trigger Constellation over and over and over again. If you imagine you have one of the omens, let's say, I don't know, the black omen that says enter the battlefield, get a creature back from your graveyard to your hand, Shimmerwing Chimera will let you use that over and over and over again. In this case, we're talking about blue-white, so imagine the white omen that gains you 2 life and puts 2 1/1s on a board. Shimmerwing Chimera lets you do that every single turn. And on top of that, it says up to 1 target artifact, or rather 1 target enchantment. So you can use this to, or rather you don't have to use this ability at all if Shimmerwing Chimera is the only enchantment on board. So I think this card is one of your key uncommons when it comes to these blue-based enchantment decks, just because it does enable some combos that are going to be fantastic in both sealed and draft. Calafi, Beloved of the Sea, is your blue demigod, and this is just a good creature all the way around. You can't complain about having a Calafi in your deck. Calafi, I don't know. You tell me how it's pronounced in the comments. This card is 1 blue for an X3, and the power there is equal to your devotion to blue, so similar to Anax, and we'll see again on the green demigod. This starts off as a 2/3 because it will count its own devotion, and it gets bigger from there. And the ones that pump power with devotion seem way, way better than the ones that pump toughness. So we talked about Timurit, we talked about Daxos. Calafi and the red one and the green one are all significantly better, even though they cost 1 additional mana, because they have the potential to be things like 5/3, 6/3s, even though most of the time they'll be around 2 to 4/3. And that's pretty good fail case for a 3-mana creature with upside. In this case, Calafi says, creatures and enchantments you control have spells your opponents cast that target this permanent cost 1 more to cast. So your opponent basically gets a small tax on top of anything that targets one of your creatures or targets one of your enchantments. So it's not a super relevant ability, right? If your opponent has a kill spell, even an expensive kill spell, usually they can just tack on an additional mana, but it does mess things up. It stops them from double spelling. It makes their really clunky removal even clunkier, and I think that's relevant. Notice it's only spells, not abilities, so a lot of the abilities that come attached to enchantments in this set, for instance, a lot of the removal that triggers when an enchantment enters the battlefield, that doesn't get taxed. So just keep that in mind, that Calafi is not like the be-all end-all protection for your spells, but it is still an extra little layer of protection on top of your cards that you're going to be wanting to resolve, including itself. She is herself an enchantment. And the best rares for this archetype, well, blue-white's a little bit slim here, but they do have a really solid rare in Dream Trawler. It's 2 white, blue, so 6 mana total for a rare Sphinx. It is a 3/5, 6 mana 3/5 with flying and lifelink. Okay, you would want maybe an extra point of power or point of toughness there, but that's a decent starting line, right? That is a flying, evasive creature that kind of swings a race with lifelink. But it has a lot more. It says, whenever you draw a card, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and whenever it attacks, draw a card. So imagine you play this, it comes back to your turn. When it attacks, you draw a card, and you've already drawn a card for the turn during your draw step, so that's at least +2/+0 that it's getting without any additional work. And if you cast an additional draw spell on top of that, it's getting bigger, which means the lifelink is going to push that game out of range for your opponent. And if that weren't enough, it has a activated ability, a built-in protection ability that says discard a card, Dream Trawler gains hexproof until end of turn, tap it. So as far as I'm concerned, Blue-white, not a super coherent strategy, but this blue-white flyer is a huge bomb in this format just because there aren't a lot of ways to get around that hexproof. If you play this card and you have maybe 1 or 2 cards in hand, you should be looking pretty good to win the game. Your opponent is going to need a flurry of spells to be able to deal with it, because as soon as you untap with it, you're going to attack and you're drawing 2 cards per turn, which is just going to put that way out of range. This is similar to something like, what is the card called? The Sphinx from Theros, Prognostic Sphinx, that's the one I'm looking for, which could attack, scry 3, it had some bonuses, but you could also discard a card to tap it and give it hexproof. The way you have to play around this card is try to kill it before it goes to attacks and just make your opponent discard a card to tap it so that they don't get that swing in, they don't draw the extra cards. But in order to keep up with that, you basically have to have a removal spell every single turn, right? Keep in mind, the best way to deal with this is try to get your opponent empty-handed and then slap it with an aura, a pacifism type effect, and that should deal with it. But that's so hard to do. It requires multiple removal spells and things of that nature, and it's going to be a lot of times that Dream Trawler hits the board and the game is just decided because it's so hard to deal with. The other card I wanted to mention here is basically a constellation payoff at rare. It's Protean Thaumaturge. 1 in a blue for a 1/1 rare human wizard, and that's it. It has constellation text, but if you're not putting enchantments into play, this card doesn't do anything. The constellation text is pretty neat, though. It says whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield, you may have Protean Thaumaturge become a copy of another target creature, except it has this ability. So enchantments turn Protean Thaumaturge into the best creature on board. So normally I'm a big fan of clones, and I think I'm going to like this card too, but it does take a little bit of work, right? Clones, I like that this is a clone that you can put on board as early as turn 2, and as long as you're able to put additional enchantments on board, this should always be on par with the best creature on the board. Note that auras kind of mess that up a little bit, since auras will push creatures one way or another, but I think Thaumaturge is going to be sweet, and the fact that you can do it multiple times if you need to change what kind of creature it is awesome. It works exceptionally well with flash enchantments like the entire Omen cycle, and I wanted to just mention it here for blue-white because it is the type of card, and you'll notice based on my reaction to blue-white here is that it seems like it's going to be hard to win a game with blue-white because you don't have built-in win cons. You don't have a linear strategy. Sure, if you open a Dream Trawler, congratulations. But outside of that, you've got to kind of build your own strategy. And something like a Protean Thaumaturge is a card that other decks might not be interested in that can provide an actual win con for your deck if you fall short. So just keep that one in mind for the purposes of blue-white. And that's going to go ahead and do it for this video. That leaves us with 2 color pairs, and then remember in a final video we'll talk about devotion decks. Next video we'll talk about red-black, which is your standard sacrifice deck, and there's a little bit going on there in this set for sure. And we'll talk about blue-green, which is going to be kind of a rehash of blue-white because it's not a very well-defined archetype, but you'll see a lot of the same cards pop up there that popped up for blue-white. With that being said, I appreciate you joining me. Again, please let me know in the comments below. Anything I missed, anything I maybe misspoke about or maybe looked over. If you know what blue-white is, or if you know what blue-green is in this set, if you know like kind of a succinct way of explaining what those decks are trying to do, feel free to let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your opinions before pre-release comes around. And again, let me know how this format works for you, how the archetype breakdown works as opposed to a full card-by-card set analysis. So that's going to go ahead and do it for this video. Thanks for watching. As always, my name's Timothy with Mana Rocks, and I will see you all in the next one.